Would you like me to go ahead?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. Let me get my screen shared. And thumbs up, Carol, if you can see that. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, folks. I'm excited to join you tonight from my house here in Ames. I do, of course, like in my past life in a non-COVID world, spent a lot of time traveling the state and giving presentations like this, and always welcomed an opportunity to go to Western Iowa and join you in person, especially this time of year where I'm sure the Les Hills are just absolutely beautiful with their fall colors. But of course, because it's 2020 and everything's uniquely challenging, I'm excited to join you from my guest bedroom at my house in Ames. The title of the talk tonight is Making Landscapes Work for Wildlife. And I always like to start a presentation like this out with an acknowledgement that I'm no landscape architect or I'm no horticulturalist. As you'll notice, I'm a wildlife biologist. I have my training is in wildlife ecology and wildlife management, and my research here at Iowa State is all on essentially where birds live on our farms primarily, and how they use the environment in very human modified landscapes. So I'm a researcher and a wildlife biologist. And so in that way, the angle or the way that I approach a talk like this is a little bit different, because I don't necessarily know, or I'm not certainly no expert on things like landscaping per se. So let me just get oriented to the screen here and get going. I want to mention a lot of things I'm going to talk about. We have resources and the like available on our website, and there's a link there, and I'll also be sure to include that link again at the end. I'm going to talk today for probably 30-40 minutes, and then hope to leave a lot of time for question and answer and learn from you all about your experiences with these things as well. And so with that, I'll get going. I see there's a couple things in the chat, so I'm just going to have the chat panel open as well. I'll keep an eye on that. I like to start this presentation with this picture. And this picture is from West Des Moines. It doesn't necessarily matter that it's from West Des Moines. I'm sure you can all recognize this view from space of a scene that we're all quite familiar with from any highly or intensively developed landscape that we live in, like, for example, around Council Bluffs or other areas. And so what I look at and I see here is, of course, the maze of subdivisions. Many of us have gotten lost, in these streets of mazes of developed spaces where people live. As a wildlife ecologist, I think about what this land maybe once looked like. And we know in Iowa, at least back to the 1930s, what this land looked like, and it looked like this. So this is a picture from that exact same place that's today West Des Moines in the 1930s, and you can see how remarkably modified that landscape is from what it looked like just in the 30s. Now, this landscape, of course, was highly modified at the time in the 1930s, even because before that, it probably would have been mostly tall grass prairie, scattered trees like shown in the picture here, and then probably perhaps even Native American settlements. And so the history of our land involves lots of manipulations. And all along the way, people and wildlife are learning to live together. So in the 1930s, it would have been how wildlife lived on our farmed landscapes. And today, in these highly modified landscapes, it's how wildlife can live alongside our humans in our high density developments. And when we ecologists look at a landscape like this, we think, of course, about the people that live there and their connections to the land and their impacts on resources like water, air, and soil and wildlife. We expect for these landscapes to perform in some way. And so in that way, a lot of times ecologists, we talk about making landscapes work. And so these places where people live, we need these places to work for many different purposes. One of, and those are sort of listed here as an example. So we need landscapes to work to fight the causes and consequences of climate change and sequester carbon in our soils or in trees and other places. We need these landscapes to work for water, both water quality and water abundance. We need these landscapes to work to provide an aesthetic that appeals to the people that live there and spend their days there. And then we, of course, need these landscapes to support biodiversity, because where people live are also the places where many wild things, both plants and animals, live. And so this accounting of making landscapes work for multiple, what we call ecosystem goods and services, could be a talk that would go on for a whole semester or even a college course. And so what I'm going to talk about today is these last couple of expectations for making our landscapes, the places where people live, work for the natural world. And I'm going to talk about supporting biodiversity and protecting natural areas from invasions. And those are some themes that I'll explore throughout my presentation here. And so in thinking about this theme of making landscapes where we live work for natural resources or for the natural world, I want to explore four key things, four key ways that every homeowner can make their landscape work for wildlife. And so these are the four things. I'm going to step through each one of them one at a time. So I'll just go ahead and get started first with number one. This is the one that is the simplest thing that everybody can do. Everybody that touches land or has impact over land probably has some area that's mowed. And what, of course, in small quantities, a little bit of mowing is totally fine. But many times we mow simply because we don't have any other ideas of what to do with that land. And in those places, mowing less often or mowing less area by landscaping can be a really good way to get more environmental benefits from the land. And so here's just two houses side by side here in Ames. The one on the left mows all of their front yard, and the one on the right landscaped all their front yard. And if you're a wildlife a critter like a bird or a small mammal, you would find a lot more potential for you in the landscape on the right than in the landscape on the left. And so that's what we kind of mean and picture when we say mow less and mow less often. Here's sort of a side-by-side comparison of what this may look like. We're going to explore the landscapes theme on the right in a lot more detail in the next rule for making landscapes work for wildlife. But here is just we can imagine a lawn or a landscape that's sort of dominated by lawn versus a landscape that has a lot of landscape elements in it. And the one on the right is going to be a lot more functional. It's going to work a lot better for wildlife. In those places where we decide to mow less or mow less often, we can think about providing wildlife by mimicking the natural habitat that wildlife are looking for. And so in those places, we like to do rule number 2, mimic natural places or mimic wild places. And so there, we want to understand what wildlife need from their environment. And so wildlife biologists like me that do education and research always like to take a step back and define what we mean when we say habitat. It's a word we use quite often, and without a definition, it can be sort of limited in its usefulness as a word. And so what I always say wildlife habitat is the 3 things we all need to survive: food, water, and shelter. And then those 3 things need to be arranged in a way that they're accessible, and we call that space. So the 4 components of wildlife habitat are the 3 things we all need to survive, and then some assurance that they're distributed in a way that we can access them at a scale that's relevant to us as an animal. So imagine if you're a person, if all the food were in Boone County and all the water were in Pottawatomie County and all the shelter were in Scott County, you wouldn't find Iowa a very hospitable place, because we simply couldn't traverse the space we would need to get to all of those habitat elements. And wildlife, of course, are the exact same way. And so when we think about our yards or the places that we have influence over, we want to think about how we're checking each one of these boxes there, or working with our neighbors to check each one of these boxes. So I'm going to walk through each one of these and just kind of explore where we can find these resources in our landscapes. So first is food. There's lots of different types of food that wildlife find in our managed landscapes. Here's a picture of fruits from a dogwood. And of course, these are produced by native woody shrubs, and this fruit this time of year in the fall can be really important food sources for many different species of wildlife. And we see that, of course, also with hard fruits like acorns, walnuts, and hickory nuts. Another source of food is nectar. So flowers in and of themselves can be food for many different species of wildlife, mostly insects like butterflies and native bees and other important pollinators, but even a few different wildlife species, of course, like hummingbirds and orioles will also consume nectar as a food source. Another really important food source that we often don't consider is the insects themselves. So we always say, for example, of forest dwelling birds that basically they live off of caterpillars. They raise their young on a diet of caterpillars. And so this beautiful caterpillar here is the caterpillar of the viceroy butterfly, which is a native butterfly that looks just like the monarch butterfly that we find here in Iowa. And it, like all or most caterpillars, is uniquely adapted to certain types of plants. And so you're probably familiar with the monarch that's uniquely adapted to raise its young on the leaves of milkweed plants. Other pollinating insects are commonly reliant on native species, and things like willows and oaks have really high densities of or high use by native caterpillars, and can thus be really important food for wildlife as well. The next habitat component that we want to think about in our backyards is shelter. And so in this case, shelter may be important, like, for example, providing a nesting location. So woody plants that have lots of horizontal branching can provide really good places for placement of a nest. Another component of shelter may be something that we don't often think about in our landscape, but could be really important, like dead wood. Either down dead wood that we'll talk about next for reptiles and amphibians, or standing dead wood like this, pictured for this red-bellied woodpecker that's excavated a cavity in that hollow tree, or another woodpecker that's excavated a cavity in that dead tree to the right. And in that way, it can be important for both woodpeckers to forage or to create their nesting cavities, or a whole suite of other species that take advantage of the hard work that woodpeckers do to create cavities in what we call secondary cavity users, birds like house wrens that move in after the woodpeckers are gone and take advantage of those cavities in landscapes. The life of a tree, we always say, extends long after the tree itself is dead. And when trees or branches fall down in landscapes and they provide an aesthetic that appeals to the homeowner, that can be a really nice element of wildlife habitat as well. Many reptiles and amphibians will live underneath or even in downwood, and other species of birds and small mammals will forage in and among downwood and landscapes as well. And it can be something nice to have out there if you have the space. Another common form of shelter in backyards is artificial structures. And so I always like to mention that this is an important part of attracting wildlife or providing wildlife habitat in the backyard, is a well-designed and well-placed structure. So in this case, that's a box built for an eastern bluebird. Eastern bluebirds, like house wrens and a lot of other birds, are secondary cavity users. So they're looking for holes to build their nests in. And if your yard is attractive, kind of an open, grassy, shrubby area, you may be able to attract eastern bluebirds or a bunch of other secondary cavity users that use artificial structures put out specifically for them. The last component of shelter that we want to consider is to remember that lots of species of wildlife stick around all winter long and will take advantage of our landscapes after, for example, migratory birds have taken off. So you can barely see it here. This is a picture I took on campus a few years ago of an eastern cottontail rabbit tucked up underneath those what remains of last year's flowering plants. This time of year, many people like to go out into their flower beds and remove, what they call deadheading all of the plant material from this year. But if the aesthetic appeals to you and you can make it work, leaving those flowering plants up can provide really good cover and even food sources for wildlife throughout the winter time, and even the following spring as many birds migrate back to their northern breeding grounds. So winter cover is another thing to consider in a backyard landscape when we think about wildlife habitat and shelter. The next element of the 3 essential elements we all need to survive is water. Not everybody can fit water into their backyard, but if you have a place that works, having a water feature back in the backyard can be a really nice way to enrich the value of your landscape for wildlife. The picture here on the left is a really neat pond surrounded by small ponds surrounded by native plants that a professor in our department built in his backyard. And thanks to this, he sees a huge diversity of birds every year because they seek out this water source that most of the other neighbors don't have. Another way to do this would be to have clean flowing water or frequently changed at least water in a bird bath in your yard. And that could be good for both birds and also some insects. So the last consideration I mentioned, we have the 3 tangible elements that we can think about making sure are found in our landscapes: food, water, and shelter. And then the last consideration is space, or the distribution of these elements in the backyard. So one would be to think about how you design your landscape. You want the landscape to appeal to your own aesthetic, what you like and want to look at. But you could also think about something that protects wildlife, like, for example, putting the food sources close to the shelter sources so that birds, for example, don't have to go far away from a safe shrub to feed on a bird feeder or to feed on a flowering plant or something like that. So that's one consideration you can make for space. The other one that I always like to say, and probably the most important, is that what happens in your neighbor's yard is as consequential, or maybe even more consequential, to the wildlife that use your yard as anything under your own control. And so we always like to say that doing right by wildlife or providing wildlife habitat in your backyard is great, but you've got to tell your story and talk to your neighbors about why it is that you're making your landscape work for wildlife, and ensure that they follow suit by planting native plants or considering food, water, and shelter. And then as the neighbors get on board, then you could really make a difference and attract a rich diversity of wildlife to your neighborhood and have a real impact on diversity of wildlife. The next rule in making landscapes work for wildlife is to choose diverse, native, or benign exotic plants. And so what I mean by this is that Iowa's landscape, of course, historically was covered by over 80% in the tallgrass prairie. And in this tallgrass prairie environment, we found hundreds of species of native flowering plants that thrive in our climates and thrive on our soils. Here's an example of just 7 of those native plants that are found in Iowa's tallgrass prairie. As I mentioned, over 300 different species have been documented in Iowa's tallgrass prairie, and they provide a rich library of possible plants to choose from to put in our own backyards. Here's a couple of examples of ones that really work quite well, depending on what kind of landscape you have. The milkweeds, of course, are very important for the monarch butterfly pictured there on the left. And we have over 15 different species of milkweeds native to Iowa. Here's the 3 most common ones that we see in landscapes and in natural areas. Lots of native wildflowers found in Iowa. Here's 3 rather common native wildflowers that do well in landscapes as well. Purple coneflower, gray-headed coneflower, and wild bergamot or bee balm. It has a bunch of different names. Those prairies, of course, were alive with a rich diversity of grasses, and many of those grasses do quite well in our landscapes as well. Little bluestem and prairie dropseed are 2 of my favorites, just as an example of just a few of the species that could potentially work. You know, I said 80% of Iowa's landscape was tallgrass prairie, but over 10% of the remaining area in the state was in forests. This was in areas where fires didn't creep down hillsides, or frequent floods prevented fires or disturbances, and allowed for the growth of forested environments. And just as the tallgrass prairie has a rich diversity of native plants found there, the forests also have a really rich diversity of native plants to choose from. Here's a couple of cool examples. Virginia bluebells are a beautiful woodland spring wildflower. Shooting star and Dutchman's breeches are all beautiful wildflowers that grow in wooded areas. Maidenhair fir and American alum root are nice shade-tolerant landscape plants. And then, of course, tons of woody plants can be found in Iowa's wooded environments and can be adapted quite well to our landscapes where we live. The last category of plants found in Iowa is about 25% of Iowa's land area, both in the prairie and in the forest, was in wetland ecosystems. And these wetlands, as pictured here, also have a rich diversity of plants found within them. And if you put in a rain garden, or you have a low-lying spot in your yard, you may find that these native wetland plants could fit really well there as well. So just a couple of examples of beautiful native wetland plants: blue flag iris, cardinal flower, and elderberry as a shrub with a beautiful flower, and of course a fruit that could be turned into jam or wine. So that was just sort of a general tour of the native plants that we could potentially choose from. And now, as I talk about the fourth rule, I'm going to dig into why it is that choosing native plants can be so important. And that's because using native plants in our landscapes can work to protect the natural habitats that surround our landscape. And so there's a couple of ways that we can live up to this fourth rule, protecting wildlife and natural habitats in our landscapes to make them work better for wildlife. One way to do that is to keep cats indoors. Cats are the leading cause of essentially human-caused mortality of wildlife. They literally kill billions of birds and small mammals every year. And wildlife biologists always like to talk about the importance of keeping cats indoors to prevent additional unnecessary mortality of birds that we attract to our landscapes otherwise. So I always encourage people to remember, if you're building a wildlife-friendly landscape, it's important to remember that cats can quickly make that wildlife-friendly landscape a dangerous environment for wildlife. So keeping cats indoors is a really good way to protect wildlife in natural places. The other way to protect wildlife in natural places is to adhere to rule number 3 and choose native plants. And the reason we want to choose native plants is because all the harm that exotic plants cause in natural areas. And so this is a picture I took during the winter, obviously, at Ledges State Park, just west of Ames here. And the plant pictured here in the foreground of the photograph in this forest at Ledges is called Japanese barberry. And of course, nobody planted this Japanese barberry at this place at Ledges State Forest or State Park. Rather, this Japanese barberry was spread there from a landscape nearby, and a bird must have consumed a fruit in the landscape and then flown out to the forest and deposited the fruit, if you know what I mean, as fruits spread that way. And then that exotic plant, Japanese barberry, took root in the forest. And in the forest, it doesn't have any natural predators and nothing to control it, because this isn't a plant that our native species of insects are adapted to, and our native species of wildlife don't necessarily want to forage on it. And so it can take off. And that happens with many different species of exotic plants. They're planted in our landscapes because they're easy to grow, because they're well adapted to our climates, and they don't have natural predators here. And then when they find their way into our natural areas, they can become really prolific. And so that's the case with Japanese barberry. It's the case of bush honeysuckle. This is a picture of an understory in a forest that's completely desolate because it's been invaded by this exotic species called bush honeysuckle. Chinese silvergrass or many grasses in the Miscanthus genus can also be really invasive, leaving our landscapes and spreading and taking over, for example, on this roadside here in central Iowa. This is Oriental bittersweet. It's a fruit that's very winter hardy and quite pretty. And so it's spread often through ornamental like decorations of the red fruits. And it can take over in a forest and outcompete our native species of bittersweet in the same genus. And it can also strangle trees and kill full-grown trees. This is burning bush. We also have a native species of burning bush with a different species name. It's called Euonymus atropurpureus. This exotic species of burning bush, or winged burning bush, although it is quite spectacular this time of year, is also, just like Japanese barberry, well adapted to our climates and soils, and doesn't have many natural predators and can take over. In this picture I took of burning bush invading a forest in Des Moines County in southeastern Iowa. And then one last exotic species that can be problematic is Siberian elm. This is the only elm we'll find in Iowa that's resistant to the Dutch elm disease, unfortunately. Our native elms succumb to Dutch elm. Siberian elms seem to be resistant to it, and then they're very prolific in their fruits, and they can invade natural areas, especially sun-rich environments. And so this picture is actually from a native prairie, a prairie that's never been plowed before. And the greatest threat that's facing this native prairie, which of course is a very rare ecosystem in Iowa, is invasion by this exotic tree that was planted innocently enough in the neighboring yards. And so when we talk about native plants, we have to think about what we mean when we say native. And so to some people, native may mean native to a specific county, or it may mean native to a region, like say the upper Midwest, or a continent, or maybe people don't even concern themselves with this native business and just think all species could go everywhere. What I want to leave you with is that I think it's important that we define native species as those native to the Midwest. These are the species that essentially would have been able to colonize our Iowa environments anyway, and thus have natural predators and are unlikely to take over in our natural areas. That's supported by some research. This is from a study done at Iowa State that looked at 28 species of woody plants, including Japanese barberry, honeysuckle, and burning bush that have become problematic in our natural areas. And you can see the vast majority of these species came from ecosystems ocean away that are at the same latitude as our ecosystems here in Iowa. And so what that tells us is that plants that are adapted to these climates and these similar ecosystems, but would have never been able to get here because of the expansive ocean, have found their way here through globalization and trade and become problematic where they no longer have these natural pests. And so I always encourage people to choose native plants, and specifically choose native plants that are native to the upper Midwest. There's a couple ways you can confirm whether or not a plant is native to the upper Midwest and will thus do no harm in your landscape. The Iowa Department of Transportation has a wonderful resource, particularly for native prairie plants, where you can search by common and scientific name. And then also the USDA NRCS has this database called the Plants Database that is a wonderful resource for figuring out where a plant is or is not native to. And I always bring this up at the nursery. I just look at the tag, find the scientific name, type it into the plants database, and make sure that it's green in Iowa or at least the upper Midwest, and then put it in my landscape. One last point on finding native plants is there's some pretty cool resources coming along for this. And this is a resource from the National Wildlife Federation that's you can put in your zip code, and it'll actually give you a list of native plants that will do well in your zip code. And it's not a comprehensive list of all the native plants that could be there. Of course, I mentioned that list would be hundreds of species long, but it's a nice list of places that you could potentially start. So I went through those 4 rules, and the last thing I want to leave you with is just a few recommendations for how to apply these principles and make your landscape work for wildlife. The first thing to do is to consider starting small. I don't want, I sometimes present this stuff, I just presented like sort of the ideal scenario, how you could positively impact wildlife and wild places by the work in your landscape. But I'm not saying you need to go out tomorrow and run a saw and get rid of everything that isn't native. I think we all just have a role to play in terms of starting small and making improvements and adhering to these principles, particularly thinking about native plants and providing food sources and providing places for wildlife to hide and shelter and other things, and incrementally work towards these sort of ideals of a working landscape for wildlife. Another key to success is redefining your relationship to weeds. I find this is often a barrier for people to, for example, not deadhead this time of year. The idea is that those areas are weedy looking. Those dead plants don't have an aesthetic that appeals to you. And what I like to always say is imagine the aesthetic for wildlife. Like imagine what that landscape or that patch of dead wildflowers means to a rabbit or means to a migrating bird looking for a seed. If you can imagine, put yourself in their shoes, so to speak, and think about the value of those areas beyond strictly aesthetics to the human eye, I think you can start to redefine your relationship to what is and isn't a weed. I always joke with my neighbors, perhaps to their chagrin, that I have a innocent until proven guilty attitude about weeds and plants that volunteer themselves in my landscape. I will certainly pull a weed if I know it to be such a problematic species, but otherwise I let them go because I think there's value of having a bunch of flowering plants and there's value in having a bunch of seed-bearing plants. So that's my approach, and maybe that's an approach that could work in your yard or landscape as well. And then finally, share what you know. That's why I have this picture of this pollinator cafe. I thought this was really cool. This was my nursery here in Ames. That local nursery was just highlighting native plants and just saying, if you want to have native plants that are going to be good for pollinators, come to the pollinator cafe, and this is where you can pick them out. I think this is a really neat way that master gardeners or others that have influence in their communities could have a real positive impacts on making our landscapes work better for wildlife by just talking about what native plants mean to you, or talking about the aesthetic in your landscape and why it is that it's good for wildlife and wild places, and why that's good for our environment. And hopefully others will follow your lead as you start small. So I mentioned at the beginning that there's lots of resources available on our website, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. Here's just a couple of examples. We have an article that goes into more detail about attracting birds to your yard. It includes things like feeding. We also have some articles from the entomology group about attracting for butterflies and also some other pollinators. I have some publications about building artificial structures for wildlife, including bat boxes and birdhouses, and then things, really neat features like imagining how you could put in a rain garden and use native plants there as well. All these things are available on this website, or also Iowa State Extension and Outreach's horticulture website. So with that, I'm going to stop and really look forward to taking your questions and discussing these things with you here for the rest of our time.
Any questions for Adam? You can use the Q&A portal or the chat feature. Well, I have a question, Adam. Can you define what a benign plant was?
Okay,
I like the term, and I think I know what you're talking about.
It's not a term that I would use. So you notice that I go out of my way to say native plant, and that's an easier definition. A native plant is one, and there is debate, like what's, like I mentioned, is it native to North America or native to the region? I don't think that those debates are that productive. I think that Midwestern rule is pretty solid. It's pretty safe, especially if, that would be a substantial improvement over the status quo. The benign exotic plant is one that doesn't have those invasive properties like burning bush or like Japanese barberry have. One that's less likely to have negative impacts in natural areas. And so the example, and the reason I use that is because I was basically criticized once by horticulture educators that were saying, you're being too hard. It shouldn't be all exotic plants. Hostas do no harm. And so I thought, okay, well, that's true. I definitely have a lot of hostas in my yard, and I definitely see a lot of hostas around town, and I've never seen them out in the natural area. And so I think it's true, obviously, that some exotic species like hostas are benign in that they don't have negative impacts and could thus be a feature in your landscape. And so I say plant native or benign exotic plants in an attempt to just acknowledge that some exotic plants are worse than others.
Fair enough. We do have a question from Christy to go back to the 2 slides with references for native plants.
So here's one of those, Christy. If you Google Iowa Living Roadside Trust Fund, you can find a lot of really nice resources. And they also have free field guides that you can request through the Living Roadway Trust Fund for prairie plants and trees and wetland plants at least. So it's a really neat resource. And then the other one, this is a statewide thing. If you're in Nebraska or anywhere in the United States, you can use this USDA plants database, and it's particularly useful with scientific names.
We've had a question. It says, this year we had a pair of crows in our yard who roosted and had 3 baby birds. They are big, noisy, and seem to take over the neighborhood. Anything to do to get rid of them or just accept them?
So I would say accept them, and maybe there's not a lot you can do to get rid of them, especially once they've started nesting. All birds, of course, are protected by state and federal law, and so we can't disturb the nest in any way. Now, if you didn't want them to come back next year, you could conceivably like remove the nest this year now that the nest would be abandoned. But if you can tolerate it, then that's probably the best approach. But yeah, some wildlife, I have a tendency to gloss over and talk about the good wildlife and forget that sometimes we have wildlife in our landscapes that are not quite so welcome. So it's a good question, and it's worth just being aware of a couple of rules that do protect wildlife in their nests and nestlings, but those wouldn't apply here for the rest of the year to that nest.
So, excuse me. So the next question was, how do we get rid of all the invasive trees and plants in the yard? We need to do this before putting in natives, right?
So yes and no. I mean, it kind of depends on what the species are. That's kind of what I meant with the start slow. You don't necessarily have to completely transform your landscape for it to be better for wildlife. You could just put in native plants in places where you want to put in a new bed or put in new plantings like shrubs or something like that. So that would be one option. But yeah, if you have like really dense or really problematic invasive plants, it's probably worth getting rid of them. It would depend on the site and the species. I, for example, at my house had a ton of bush honeysuckle, one of those invasive species that I profiled when I moved in here a few years ago. And I had to cut it all down. I used herbicide to treat the stumps so that it wouldn't resprout. And then I've planted native shrubs back in behind it.
Great. Next question is, how do I get rid of Japanese hops?
So I don't know the answer, Catherine, to the best method. So let me try to think who you could contact to get that answer. I was trying to remember if we have Japanese hops profiled on our website. We have a bunch of invasive species profiled on our website and specific recommendations for how to control them, including like the right herbicide to use. But I'm almost certain we don't have Japanese hops on there. And so what I would do now is direct you to one of 2 resources. you could call the county conservation board, and they would probably have experience, because Japanese hops is pretty problematic in the Missouri River Valley just in general. So you could potentially call the county conservation board and ask them that question, because they'll have firsthand experience. Or you could call your district forester. Everybody in Iowa has a forester at the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, whose job it is to help private forest landowners manage timber and forest health, like invasive species like Japanese hops, on their forest. And I know that district foresters in Western Iowa are dealing with Japanese hops, and I know that they would know the answer. So another pitch to the website, if you go to that naturalresources.extension.iastate.edu website, there's a link up at the top, I think on the very far right, that says like contacts. If you click on that, click on Pottawatomie County, it'll give you the contact information for both county conservation and your district forester. Yeah, up in the upper right there, Carol, it says contacts, like in the menu. Yep. And then if you click like forestry, yep. And then click on Pottawatomie. And then there would be, scroll down a little bit. Oh, I think you must have hit, did you hit wildlife?
I didn't think so, but maybe. No?
Oh, it is forestry. Huh. Well, that's a glitch. You just helped me find it was a glitch. Sorry about that, folks. If you click on, Carol, if you click on wildlife habitat programs and consultation, to the left, right there. And then click on pot again. Let's see what this shows. Scroll down. Keep scrolling. There should be a forester around here. Dang it. Okay. Well, we'll have to figure that out, and I can get that to you, Carol.
I'm going to take the next question, Norm. There has not been a replacement for Richard at the Hort line. They are no longer doing that. That's a budget cut at the university level. So we certainly wish Richard the very best in his retirement. If you have horticulture questions, you can give me a call at the West Pottawatomie Extension Office. Our number is 366-7070. And I will ask one last question, Adam, and I know I've asked you this before, but I'm going to ask you publicly in front of everybody. How do we not encourage nuisance wildlife? We want to help wildlife, we want to encourage it, but we don't want to create nuisance. So how do we do that responsibly? Yeah,
well, what do you have in mind when you say nuisance wildlife? What species?
So in an urban county like we are, my classic example is across the street from the office. There's a couple who put out feed for turkeys and deer next to a major road.
Yeah.
And it causes lots of problems.
Well, that solution's pretty obvious. I mean, the food is the problem. And it's a great question, like just being aware, you know, of these, I guess, the trade-offs in the system. And so we could apply the same principles that I just talked about: food, water, shelter, cover, and space, right? Or food, water, shelter, and space. Those are the levers that we can manipulate with wildlife. So I thought you would maybe say, how do I deal with rabbits in my garden? Well, the best way to deal with rabbits in the garden is to have a good defense, have a good fence that excludes rabbits from the garden so that they can't become a problem. And that's true of a lot of different things that we do in wildlife. Like, for example, the feeding thing, like, obviously we should discourage people from feeding wildlife close to roads. That's the fourth principle. That's protect wildlife. I mentioned just keep your cats indoors, but it's also important that if you live next to a freeway, maybe you don't attract things that are going to become roadkill. And then, yeah, on the deer thing, like, we shouldn't actually ever feed deer because that's bad for deer because of disease transmission issues too. It's always worth mentioning that.
All right, well, Adam, I don't see any more questions, so I'm going to wrap it up for tonight. But thank you for joining us, and for the participants, as you leave, there will be a survey, if just 3 quick questions. If you'll do that on your way out, we really appreciate it. Join us in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking about shrubs in the landscape. So join me for that talk. That'll be the last one for this fall, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.